No one was clapping. There were no lights, no cameras, no curtains slowly rising. No orchestra waiting for a cue, no producer counting down in her ear. And yet, in that moment, Whitney Houston delivered the most powerful performance of her entire life. She was far from a stage, far from everything the world had come to associate with her name. There was no sparkling gown, no gold microphone in her hand. Instead, she sat in silence, in a space too small to hold everything she carried inside. And for the first time in years, she wasn't singing for the world. She was singing for herself. This story begins when the noise disappears. For most of her life, Whitney had been taught that her voice had a purpose: to fill arenas, move millions, and meet impossible expectations. Every note was judged, every breath compared to the last. The world didn't want to hear who she was becoming. It wanted who she had always been. But there is a kind of performance that doesn't demand perfection. It only demands truth. That night, without an audience or a script, Whitney let something escape that had never been rehearsed. It wasn't a famous song. It wasn't a chorus the world recognized. It was fragile, broken, almost a whisper. And yet, it carried more power than any standing ovation she had ever received. There was no pressure to succeed, no fear of failing, no one left to impress. Only her voice and everything she had been trying to hide. The world never saw this performance. There is no recording. No headline ever told it. But it happened, and it changed everything. Because sometimes, the most powerful performance isn't the one the audience sees, it's the one that forces us to face who we really are when no one is watching. If you want to understand why this unseen moment mattered more to Whitney than any sold-out arena, stay with us. What happened next revealed a side of her the world never applauded. Whitney Houston had spent most of her life surrounded by sound. Applause followed her everywhere, thunderous, relentless, intoxicating. From sold-out arenas to award shows, from radio waves to television screens, her voice filled spaces larger than most people could imagine. The world knew her as power, precision, and perfection wrapped into a single name. But what the world didn't see was what happened when the noise stopped. It wasn't sudden. The silence crept in slowly, almost politely, the way exhaustion does when it knows it will eventually win. After years of performing, promoting, proving, and surviving expectations that were never meant for a single human being, Whitney found herself alone more often than she was prepared for. Hotel rooms became quieter. Phones rang less. Mirrors lingered longer. And in those moments, the applause that once defined her felt distant, almost unreal. Whitney had been taught early that her voice was not just a gift, but a responsibility. People depended on it. Record labels, fans, family, an entire industry built on the belief that as long as she could sing, everything else would somehow hold together.
So she sang.
Even when she was tired, even when she was hurting, even when her heart begged for rest. Especially then. By the time the applause began to fade, she didn't know who she was without it. One evening, after a long day that ended without a stage or a spotlight, Whitney sat alone in a quiet room. No entourage, no schedule, no performance waiting on the other side of the door. Just her thoughts, and the echo of a life lived in front of millions. She tried to hum the way she always had. A soft warm-up, something familiar. But the sound came out differently. Thinner, careful, honest. It startled her. For the first time, her voice wasn't reaching outward. It was turning inward. She realized then that she had spent years singing at the world, but almost no time listening to herself. The songs had always carried meaning for others: love, loss, hope, heartbreak, but she had rarely allowed them to mean those things to her. That night, there was no expectation to hit the perfect note. No fear of criticism. No pressure to be Whitney Houston, the legend. She was simply a woman with a voice that carried stories she had never finished telling. And something broke open. Memories surfaced without warning, moments of joy, moments of confusion, moments where she had smiled for cameras while silently asking for help. The applause had always drowned those thoughts out. But now, in the stillness, they spoke clearly. Whitney understood something that frightened her and relieved her at the same time. Her greatest performance had always been survival. Not the high notes. Not the awards. Not the ovations. Survival. She had survived pressure that crushed others. She had survived being admired but not always understood. She had survived being loved for her voice more than for her humanity. But surviving was not the same as living. As the silence wrapped around her, Whitney felt the weight of a truth she could no longer ignore. The world had celebrated her strength, but it had never given her permission to be weak. And she had never given that permission to herself. That night marked the beginning of something quiet but dangerous, not to the world, but to the image it had built of her. Because once the applause stops, there is no place left to hide. And Whitney was finally ready to listen to what remained when everything else fell away. Morning arrived without ceremony. No alarms. No handlers knocking at the door. No schedule taped to the mirror. Whitney woke to a silence, so complete it almost felt unfamiliar, as if the world itself had decided to leave her alone for once. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, listening to her own breathing. It was slower than she remembered.
Deeper. Human.
For years, her mornings had been rehearsals for performance. Interviews to prepare for. Appearances to polish. A voice to protect at all costs. Even her rest had been strategic. But now, there was nothing to prepare for. And that frightened her more than any stage ever had. She got out of bed and walked to the window. Outside, the city moved without noticing her. Cars passed. People laughed, argued, hurried. No one looked up expecting a miracle note or a flawless smile. Whitney Houston existed here only as another woman behind glass. And for the first time, that felt peaceful. She made coffee herself, clumsily, and used to doing things without help. The sound of the machine brewing felt louder than any applause she remembered. Every small action seemed magnified, as if her senses were recalibrating after years of sensory overload. Whitney sat at the table and let the cup warm her hands. She didn't sing. She didn't hum. She didn't test her range. She just sat. That restraint was new. Her voice had always been her shield, a way to communicate without explaining, to express without exposing. When words felt dangerous, music had made things safer. But now, without an audience, the voice had nowhere to perform. And that was the point. As the day unfolded, Whitney felt memories surface not as performances, but as experiences. The first time she sang in church, before she knew the weight of expectations. The laughter between notes. The joy of singing simply because it felt good. Back then, her voice hadn't been currency. It had been connection. Somewhere along the way, the connection had been replaced by consumption. The world wanted Whitney Houston, not Whitney the woman. And she had learned to give them exactly that, polished, powerful, unbreakable. Even when she felt anything but. She walked through the apartment, touching objects she had ignored for years. Photographs, letters, unfinished notebooks, evidence of a life paused between tours and obligations. She opened one notebook and found lines she barely remembered writing, thoughts about exhaustion, confusion, faith, and fear. They were messy, unfiltered, honest. They scared her, because honesty meant admitting that the strongest voice in the room could still feel unheard. Whitney realized something unsettling. Without the stage, she didn't know how to introduce herself. If she wasn't the voice, then who was she? The question echoed louder than any stadium ever had. She stepped outside later that afternoon, wearing sunglasses and a hat, not to be recognized, but to feel invisible. Walking through the city without being watched felt like learning to breathe again. No one asked her to sing. No one asked her to be extraordinary. And for once, she didn't have to be. As the sun dipped lower, Whitney found herself sitting alone in a small, quiet space. No spotlight, no microphone, and she finally allowed herself to speak aloud, softly, just to the room. "I'm tired." The words landed with more power than any note she had ever held. That admission wasn't weakness. It was truth. And in that truth, Whitney began to understand that the most powerful performance of her life was never meant for an audience at all. It was meant for her, a private reckoning, a reclaiming of a voice that had been shared with the world, but rarely with herself. The applause had taught her how to shine. The silence was teaching her how to survive. And for the first time, she was willing to stay in it long enough to find out who she really was without the noise. Silence has a way of pretending it's empty when it's actually full of voices you've been avoiding. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt different after sunset, smaller, heavier, as if the walls were holding their breath. I lay on the couch, staring at the darkened ceiling, listening to the city hum outside. Somewhere far away, music drifted through an open window. Not mine. Someone else's song. Someone else's dream. And for reasons I couldn't explain, it hurt. I sat up and hugged a pillow to my chest, trying to slow my thoughts. Without stages and schedules, my mind had too much room to wander. Memories didn't arrive neatly. They came in fragments, flashes of faces, dressing rooms, arguments whispered behind doors, applause crashing like waves that never let me surface. People always say silence is peaceful. They don't tell you it can also be brutal. I walked into the bathroom and turned on the light. The mirror caught me off guard. I looked older than I remembered. Not because of wrinkles, because of wear. My eyes carried a tired honesty I'd learned to hide on camera. This was the face no one paid for. No filters. No lighting tricks. Just me. I leaned closer, studying my reflection like a stranger. "Who are you now?" I asked softly. The question didn't scare me. The lack of an answer did. I splashed water on my face and laughed quietly at myself, a brittle sound. I had faced sold-out crowds without fear, but this? Standing alone, stripped of the persona that had protected me for decades? This felt dangerous. Because if I stopped performing, I'd have to start remembering. And the memories were already lining up. I remembered being told when to smile, when not to speak, when to sing through pain because the show couldn't stop. I remembered being praised for my strength while quietly punished for my vulnerability. Every time I tried to slow down, someone reminded me how many people depended on me being on. They never asked if I was okay. They asked if I was ready. I returned to the living room and sat on the floor, my back against the couch. I closed my eyes and did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not the polished prayers I'd said in interviews. Not the ones that sounded reassuring to fans. This one was messy, broken, full of pauses. "I don't know who I am without this," I whispered. "And I'm scared." The words trembled in the air, unaccompanied by melody. My voice cracked, not from strain, but from honesty. And for once, I didn't try to fix it. I stayed there for a long time, letting the fear speak, letting the grief speak, letting the anger speak. Every emotion I'd wrapped in music finally demanded words. That's when I heard it. A knock.
Sharp. Sudden.
Too loud for the quiet I'd built around myself.
My heart jumped.
I hadn't told anyone where I was staying. No assistants. No friends. No security. This space was supposed to be mine, untouched. The knock came again. I stood slowly, every instinct on edge. Fame teaches you that unexpected attention is never innocent. I walked toward the door, my footsteps careful, rehearsing excuses I didn't want to give. "Who is it?" I asked. A pause. Then a voice, familiar, calm, and entirely unwelcome. "Whitney," it said. "We need to talk." My stomach tightened. That voice belonged to someone from the life I was trying to step away from. Someone who knew things. Someone who didn't knock unless something was about to change. I rested my hand on the doorknob, suddenly unsure if opening it would pull me back into the world I was trying to escape, or force me to face a truth I wasn't ready to hear. And as the silence stretched between us, I realized something chilling. This quiet chapter of my life was already ending, whether I wanted it to or not. I didn't open the door right away. My hand stayed frozen on the knob as if the metal itself could decide for me. On the other side stood a voice that carried contracts, expectations, and consequences. A voice that belonged to the world I had tried, Foolishly, maybe. To step away from. Whitney, the voice said again, softer this time. I know you're in there. Of course he did. I closed my eyes and took a breath that felt heavier than any note I'd ever held. Running had never really been my strength. Singing through things was. Smiling through things. Enduring. But this silence had changed me just enough to know that pretending nothing was wrong was no longer an option. I opened the door. He stood there alone, impeccably dressed, calm in the way people get when they believe they still have control. His eyes scanned my face immediately, not with concern, but calculation. He was measuring how much of the old Whitney remained. You disappeared, he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. People are asking questions. I shut the door behind him, my heart pounding. I needed space. He smiled tightly. Space isn't something you can afford. There it was. The truth, stripped of any pretense of care. He began pacing my living room, glancing at the bare walls, the untouched piano, the absence of chaos. There are contracts in motion, he continued. Tour dates. Sponsors. A documentary that's already been teased. If you go quiet now, it looks bad. For who? I asked. He stopped and looked at me. For everyone. The answer was telling. I felt something shift inside my chest, a slow burn of anger I'd spent years smothering under professionalism. I'm not everyone, I said. I'm a person. He sighed, as if I were being difficult rather than honest. You're Whitney Houston. That's bigger than you. The words landed like a threat. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table between us. There are rumors, he said carefully. Things you've been saying. Things you might be planning to say. My stomach dropped. About what? About the industry. About pressure. About people who helped build what you became. He met my eyes. You need to be careful. Some stories don't play well in public. Careful. The word echoed with a warning I understood all too well. I opened the folder despite myself. Inside were transcripts, notes, fragments of conversations I didn't remember consenting to be recorded. Private moments. Vulnerable confessions. Pieces of me, rearranged to tell a story I didn't recognize. My hands began to shake. This was never meant to leave this room, I said. He shrugged. Nothing ever is. Until it does. Fear crawled up my spine. Not the fear of exposure, but the fear of being rewritten. Of having my truth turned into leverage. Of realizing that the silence I'd chosen had already been invaded. You don't get to decide what I say anymore, I whispered. His expression hardened. You don't get to decide what happens if you do. The air between us thickened. This wasn't concern. It was containment. I suddenly understood the real danger. It wasn't that I might speak the truth. It was that I might do it on my own terms. He gathered his things and moved toward the door.
Think about it, he said.
You've built something fragile. Don't be the one who breaks it. When he left, the apartment felt violated, like my quiet had been contaminated. I sank onto the couch, my heart racing, my mind spiraling. The past hadn't just knocked. It had reminded me why so many people stay silent. Because silence is safer. Or so they want you to believe. I looked at the notebook on the table. The one filled with unfiltered thoughts, unpolished truths. And for the first time, the question wasn't whether I could keep quiet. It was whether I could survive if I didn't. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. Somewhere, decisions were being made without me. And I knew, deep down, that whatever I chose next would change everything. Because now the danger wasn't hypothetical. It was watching me, waiting for me to speak. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the folder reappeared. Pages filled with my own words, rearranged, stripped of context, sharpened into weapons. I kept hearing his voice. You've built something fragile. As if my life were a glass sculpture owned by everyone but me. By morning, the fear had curdled into something else. Resolve. I sat at the table with the notebook open in front of me, the same one I'd almost been too afraid to read. My handwriting looked uneven, emotional, alive. It wasn't brand safe. It wasn't marketable. It was real. And I realized something that made my chest tighten. They weren't afraid of my weakness. They were afraid of my clarity. I picked up the phone and stared at the contacts I hadn't touched in months. Lawyers, managers, friends who had slowly become distant when I stopped being convenient. Then there was one number I hadn't called in years, someone who had known me before the machine, before the myth. I hesitated only a moment before dialing. Whitney, the voice said, surprised and warm. Is everything okay? No, I answered honestly. But I need you. Saying that felt like stepping off a cliff. I explained what had happened. The folder. The warnings. The unspoken threat hanging in the air. I expected caution. I expected fear. What I got was silence, the good kind. The kind where someone is listening. They don't own your truth, she said finally. But if you speak, you have to be ready for what comes after. I am, I said, even though my hands were shaking. I think I have to be. The rest of the day moved quickly. Calls were made. Meetings scheduled. Not with the people who wanted to control the story, but with the ones who could protect me while I told it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't being managed. I was choosing. Late that afternoon, I received a message that made my stomach drop. We heard you've been making calls. This isn't wise. No signature. No name. Just a reminder that I was being watched.
I didn't respond.
Instead, I did something that felt both terrifying and freeing. I began writing a statement, not a performance, not an interview soundbite, but a confession. About pressure. About silence. About how easy it is to lose yourself when everyone benefits from you staying the same. Every sentence felt like pulling a thread from a tightly woven costume. With each word, the image unraveled. The perfect voice, the effortless strength, the illusion that I had never been afraid. By evening, the statement was done. I read it aloud once, my voice trembling. No music, no melody to soften the edges. Just truth, raw and exposed. I cried halfway through, not because it hurt, but because it didn't anymore. That's when the knock came again. 3 sharp raps. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't told anyone about the statement. I walked slowly to the door, every instinct screaming at me to be careful. Through the peephole, I saw 2 figures. Not him this time. Strangers. One held a badge. The other carried a folder thicker than the last. Ms. Houston. A voice called calmly. We need to speak with you regarding a matter that's just come to our attention. My phone buzzed in my hand. A single text message lit up the screen. If you release that statement, this becomes much bigger than you. I stood there, caught between the truth I was finally ready to share and the power that had been waiting for me to try. My hand hovered over the lock. Behind me, the notebook lay open on the table. My words, my voice, my choice. And in that moment, I understood the real cost of speaking. It wasn't losing everything. It was finding out how much people were willing to take from you to stop you from telling the truth. I opened the door. Not because I felt brave, but because I was done being afraid. The 2 figures stood calmly, professional, careful with their words. They introduced themselves, explained procedures, spoke in language designed to sound neutral. But I understood what was happening. This wasn't about concern. It was about containment, about slowing me down long enough for someone else to regain control. I listened. I nodded. I answered only what I had to. And the entire time, something inside me remained still, because the decision had already been made. After they left, the apartment fell quiet again. But it was a different kind of silence now, no longer heavy, no longer suffocating. This silence felt earned. I walked back to the table and looked at the statement one last time. The words didn't shake anymore. They stood firm, like they'd been waiting years to exist. I pressed send. There was no dramatic music. No explosion. Just a soft confirmation on the screen, delivered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then my phone began to vibrate.
Calls.
Messages. Notifications stacking faster than I could read them. Some were supportive. Some were panicked. Some were angry. The world was waking up to a version of me it hadn't been prepared to meet. I turned the phone face down. For the first time in my life, I didn't need to hear the reaction to know I had done the right thing. I walked to the piano and sat down slowly. My fingers rested on the keys, but I didn't play. I thought about how many times I'd been told that my voice was my greatest weapon, and how rarely anyone had asked what it cost me to carry it. The truth was simple and devastating. I had been strong for everyone else for so long that I'd forgotten how to be honest with myself. That night, I didn't sing to prove anything. I sang quietly, imperfectly, letting notes fall where they wanted. My voice cracked. I didn't stop. I smiled through tears I no longer tried to hide. It wasn't a performance. It was release. In the days that followed, things changed, some gently, some violently. Doors closed. Others opened. People I thought I needed disappeared. People I never expected stood beside me. The world debated my words, but that wasn't my burden anymore. I had told the truth. And the truth didn't ask for applause. It asked for courage. I realized something then that no award, no chart position, no standing ovation had ever taught me. Silence can be powerful, but only when it's chosen. When silence is forced, it becomes a prison. When truth is spoken, even quietly, it becomes freedom. I didn't stop performing that night. I stopped pretending. And in doing so, I found something I had been missing beneath every note I ever sang myself. The world may remember my voice, but this moment, this unseen, unrecorded decision, was where I finally learned how to listen to it. And that was the performance that saved me.